Mhm.
Hey everyone, I see everybody starting to file in. We'll wait another minute or so, and I'll just talk faster when we when we get started. Just want to give people time to come in. Thanks for joining us. Okay, I'll get started real quick. So on the agenda today, we'll introductions isn't quite right, but I want to introduce you all to the concept behind the series, talk a little bit about the series and 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 talk about a bit about what's behind the main idea for this event. And then we're going to have a presentation from Patricia Williams, a product engineer at Esri. And then we're going to have a moderated discussion between um, moderated by myself with Patricia Williams from Esri and Kristen Washington. Um, and we'll talk more about our guests when we get to that point, and then we'll leave some time for audience Q&A. I said I would talk faster. So this event series, if you've been following, was done in collaboration with a lot of groups. Some of our groups are very much focused on folks in the African diaspora, but we've all come together really with a broad focus on diversity and inclusion, particularly in the workplace, particularly around geography and GIS, looking to grow our collective communities and our networks, share our stories, and provide an opportunity to showcase expertise. And so hopefully you had a chance to listen to the event that just ended at 3. Those folks from Here Technologies were sharing their journeys and getting patents that help to strengthen their company, but also um, their own professional background and expertise, and just really just using that to talk about the importance of innovation and just how to go about that. So hopefully you had a chance to participate in that. Anyway, so all of our groups are coming together around some interconnected purposes. Most of us are focused in some way on equity or belonging in GIS and looking to promote diversity, inclusion, and equity in the field. Many of our orgs are also focused on social impact in some way, shape, or form or another, and we've come together around Black History Month. Following the theme for this year of the Black family, we've sort of intersected that concept with mapping to ask the question, to challenge all of us to ask ourselves the question as well, who maps the Black family? And while we look at the Black family, we can really expand that out to who's mapping communities of color more broadly, who's mapping and solving and using GIS and geography just to understand and address the problems that are being faced by communities of color. So the Association for the Study of African American Life and History set themes for Black History Month, and they have for since its inception. And this year it's the Black family. And roughly, what we want to tap into to that around that theme is that it's a topic of the Black family itself is a topic of study for many disciplines. The Black family is in a lot of ways seen as the foundation of life and history for the African diaspora. It's said to offer a rich tapestry for exploring African diasporic past and present. Um, and while it has been reverenced by many, it is also stereotyped and vilified. So we're calling everyone, the call to action for everyone is to really think about how each of us can find ways to create and hold seats at the table for Black folks whenever there are opportunities to discuss problems and solutions that impact us. So we came together to around that idea, to share information about the rich heritage and impact of the African diaspora, to talk about ways to bring GIS to bear to, to innovate. And as always, continue to talk about that ongoing pursuit of progress in society, economics, and health. We had a pretty robust set of events, several events, for the most part, at least 2 a week, except for last week. And today we had 2. Hope folks also had a chance to check out the Black Girls Map event that happened today as well. And you're here at the final event of the series, The Impact of Bias, focusing on the impact of bias in data design and analysis, specifically when we think about who maps the Black family. Now I want to talk a little bit about like why that's important. And some of this will sound very familiar for folks who've heard me talk about racial equity in the past. But Black families all around the world are trying to live healthy and successful lives. They're trying to make the best of the resources within their communities. They're trying to provide a strong foundation for prosperity and health for their children. And Black kids are just trying to live and grow up. And yet we often find ourselves in situations where we are plagued with a wide range of racial inequities, some communities dealing with underfunded schools, yet over policing, some families dealing with intergenerational economic hardships and underemployment, and way too many of our children are growing up with limited access to technology, yet overexposure to toxins. And there are lots of organizations and individuals trying to understand what these issues look like and address them. And in fact, many cities and states and counties have declared racism as a public health crisis, recognizing that racism is fundamentally at the core, and is a part of the underpinnings of what is reducing the lives and livelihoods of Black people, and people of color in their geographies. And it is very much important to apply an intersectional racial equity lens when exploring these challenges. It isn't enough to just look at Black people as a monolith, to just say, oh, you're Black and that is what your experience will be. We understand that it's broader and deeper than that. We also understand that race and ethnicity, and even caste aren't the only ways that people are racialized. You could be racialized for things like religion, language, immigration status, country of origin, and all those things play a factor in racial identities, as do other factors like gender, sexual orientation, age, ability, and then other factors like income, home ownership, things that really communicate in our society, class. But all of those facets intersect with location to either impact where you can live, where you can work, and where people can spend their time, or impact the experiences that we all have, given our perceived racialized identity in these spaces where we live, work, play, and where we travel. So it's important to apply an intersectional racial equity lens that gets at overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage, like racism, anti-Semitism, tribalism. Those people probably can readily align with the concept of racism, but also intersecting with classism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia. Just imagine the Black family that comes from the Caribbean, or from an African country to the US. They're experiencing some level of xenophobia, intersecting with racism. Women and other marginalized identities, gender identities in the Black diaspora are going to be dealing with intersections of racism and sexism or homophobia. LGBTQIA plus folks, and more specifically, will be dealing with, if they're Black, are dealing with intersections of racism and homophobia, but perhaps also xenophobia and classism, and so on. So it's important to look intersectionally. And these issues are complex and they're different, and they happen in different ways in lots of different places. And very often, even as we consider this complexity, we find ourselves focusing primarily on outcomes. And we look perhaps just at, school attrition rate or educational performance or um, or career advancement outcomes. And in a lot of ways, people will say that, um, oh, well, Black people in Black families aren't doing well because they're Black. When the reality is, it's really about things like the community conditions that Black families find themselves living in, the that lead to outcomes. And further upstream, it's really about those decisions and practices that drive the assets and circumstances that are within the communities that we live in that ultimately impact what our outcomes look like. And to talk about that a little bit in a little more detail, when we think about outcomes, we should really consider those downstream individual, group, and family um, results that tend to be more visible, and they impact us where we, for individuals, families, and communities, there are things like I said, school attrition, diabetes outcomes, birth weight, uh, asthma, and how well asthma is managed for folks, and underemployment, homelessness. But we really want to shift our gaze a bit so that we can look upstream and consider how where people live and where they work and where they play impacts their outcomes, because the assets and conditions that are within our neighborhoods are different. And a lot of times they're different based on historic and contemporary practices by governments, businesses, and communities that have literally determined where Black families get to live. They have impacted Black families in terms of um, economically making it more difficult for folks to move from wherever they are. And we think of those upstream practices that can contribute to those racial inequities as either creating, sustaining, or not preventing things like structural racism or other forms of discrimination, bias based on social group like class or gender, lack of access to resources or inequitable distributions of power, and then intergenerational inequities. This would be how um, Black families, for instance, that have been in the U.S. under these decisions and practices for many generations, how it affects our families today. These all intersections of the above, how they may be affecting our families today because they've affected our grandparents, our grandparents' parents, their parents, and so on. So it's important to look across this whole landscape of outcome streams to understand needs and challenges in a very nuanced way and apply that intersectional racial equity lens. And guess what? There are lots and lots of tools and techniques and technologies that we can bring to bear to address these challenges. And when we think about this global pandemic that we've been experiencing, where great minds came together to try to alter the course of COVID-19, and in lots of ways using GIS to do so, and yet still having this experience where the virus is proving to be 3 times more deadly for Black and Latinx families. And as we're thinking about how we implement a vaccine programs and get vaccines to folks all across the country, we have to deal with this legacy of racism that makes some folks less likely to want to take the vaccine. So when we think of all this, a big question that comes to mind, well, who's helping to solve these problems? What perspectives are at the forefront when we're thinking about these challenges? What perspectives were at the forefront when designing a capability like this to understand what challenges we needed to focus on? And To what degree, given those perspectives, was racial equity involved? Was it front and center enough so that we could get ahead of these disparities before they happen? So this brings us to a question, the question of our event series, the question that we want you to all ask yourselves: who makes the maps? And what perspectives frame the problems and the solutions? And to talk a little bit about that, we've got Patricia Williams to share some of her thoughts.
Okay, hello. Hi, I'm Patricia Williams, and I'm a product engineer for the Learn ArcGIS team. I focused on quality control and assurance and making sure that the users are having a good time with the map making and learning all the good ways that GIS can help us solve problems. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about who maps the Black family and some of the historical and structural context that have played into how that happens today. So let me just start this. Okay. Um, so today's presentation is about the impact of data, the impact of bias in data analysis and design. And so this is important because we have to recognize that data analysis and design usually seems to be something that doesn't include bias because you're dealing with facts and dealing with tables, but the way that we acquire that data and the way that we analyze and understand it helps us uncover deeper biases, and hopefully that once we start to uncover them, we can come up with better solutions to solve problems. So the three assets that we're going to be focusing on now are the foundations, research, and results that go into a project, and considering bias in all three stages. So first is the foundations, and that is the ideas and motivations behind a project. It's important to consider bias in the very beginning of the project rather than once you finally get your results. And you can do this by asking yourself questions like, what are your motivations for choosing this topic, and who are the stakeholders? This can be as simple as a class project where you have a professor that you're trying to get to give you a good grade, or as complex as a work project where you want your boss is asking you to show something. And in both cases, you have to consider how what they're asking you for affects the information that you're trying to collect. Does it mean that you'll leave out some details? Does it mean that you'll focus on some things more than another? And how does that in turn affect your complete project? Another question you can ask is, who is your audience? Who are you trying to articulate this information to, and what do you want them to get out of it? And the last thing that I want us to consider for this is, what parameters are being used to define success or accuracy of the results? What success means to me might not necessarily be success to another person, or statistics that we think mean that something is good or bad might be different based on how we look at it. So it's important to find out what that means to you specifically and to your project, and consider that into the results. So a source that we like to think of as unbiased in data collection is the census. And this is just some data from a recent census focusing on counties specifically, and they're showing you the most dominant race within that, or ethnicity, because Hispanic is here, and other ethnicities, but you're seeing the most dominant. So that doesn't mean that every spot only has a certain type of people, but it's showing you dominance. Whereas it can say, if you zoom in, and this isn't the actual map, but you can access it on arcgis.com. If you zoom into more of the LA area where I'm from, around LA County, there's a lot more diversity into who's in what area. But we have to look at things like this and see, what are we missing when we look at it? Because this can be simplified to tract and smaller to see what groups are where, but also, how was this data created and who was it created for? So I was implored to wonder those questions and try to come up with some answers myself. So I found out that historically the census has disproportionately undercounted the Black population. And to today's standards, this is still happening with every community, including Asian and now primarily Hispanic, with the count being, I believe they said more than 10% of the Hispanic population in the US they don't think are getting accounted for. And they have measures of either doubling data and things to try to combat that, but it is worth noticing that Black people have been disproportionately undercounted, and start to think about why that may be. And so some answers that I was able to find was first, political motivations and government distrust. When it comes to census data collection, you have to understand that the identities that have been used to oppress different communities throughout time, whether it be Irish, Asian, Japanese specifically, Hispanic, Muslim. These identities have been used against people in terms to diminish or to create restrictions to access to certain services, to finances, housing, and a lot of different sectors. So it's not irrational for people to have distrust in even self-identifying for the census data. And that also goes into stigmas that are around race and identity, whereas someone might not want to say on a document that they're a part of a certain group, just from the understanding of the way that that group is looked at or treated, which has historically been a problem for Black people when it comes to housing loans, bank loans, access to schooling, and other factors. So that's just on the census in 2020 and considerations that we can take. The best way to make sure that you're considering your bias is by understanding your own positionality and where you fit in the project. That's by asking yourself questions like, what ideas are you bringing with you into the study? What are some pre-existing biases that you may have? And what intersections in your identity influence the ways that you think? A lot of us like to believe that our biases, we're not biased and things like that. But the reality is that we all have a lot of different factors of our identity that play into how we think, the way that we see things, and the way that we move. For example, I can say that I'm Black, but I'm also a woman, and that differs my experience from a Black man. I'm able-bodied, so that changes my experience from someone that's disabled. And there are a lot of other different factors of my identity that contribute to the way that I think. And once you realize that, you can help to untangle them from your research. Something specifically this made me think of, I have a personal opinion that I can tell you who is Black, just as a Black person. And the reality of it, as I was thinking, is that my Black identity was not necessarily something that I chose for myself. And historically, it hasn't been something that Black people have chosen for themselves. And this dates back to something to even before this, but a specific example I want to cite is the one drop rule. And in 1911, Arkansas passed the Act 320, which is known as the one drop rule, which made interracial cohabitation illegal. And it also defined a Negro as anyone that has Negro blood whatsoever. So even if you had one drop of Negro blood, you were considered Black and a second-class citizen. And this bill, it's important to say that it was backed by scientific racism and white supremacist ideals. What I mean by that is that if you think about the one drop rule in terms of any other community, there's no one drop for if you're Black and have a one drop of whiteness that you're considered white. And that's just not the way that things work, because this was backed by the idea that there was a pure white, and that anything infiltrating into pure white was not first class citizenship worthy. And so these ideals and how we even understand who are the Black people in America have been shaped by biases and understandings that were before we were even here. And I got this quote from the Anti-Racist Feminism, Critical Race and Gender Studies Halifax, and they brought about how many scientists have been satisfied to use statistics, poor methodology, and illogical conclusions to prove the theory that biology is a predictor of culture without regard for real evidence stating the opposite. This goes right into what I was saying, that there is no, the background of the one drop rule does not apply for either other races or even backwards. So the actual scientific legitimacy of it is not there. However, it was used to uphold laws and to map the Black family in terms of census data and who was marked as a Black person. So again, the last two notes that I wanted to talk about with understanding positionality is that you should ask yourself, what are some considerations or positions that you may have not originally thought about? As I said, we come in with a lot of biases. So try to think outside of your bubble and outside of what you know to come up with better conclusions. And lastly, what are some limitations in accessibility that you may face? I'm asking specifically in data collection and production because you have to think about, for myself specifically, I went to India on a project understanding identity, and I had a lot of limitations to face in terms of being able to speak the same language and wondering if what I was saying was going to be translated right. That can even be, it doesn't have to be language as much as it can just be the way you communicate or the words that you use, and how that limits the data that you can gather. And I just have a simple list of limitations and considerations that we'll talk about at the end. So on that topic, we can think about the post-Emancipation Proclamation census data. This was the first year collected after slavery was abolished. Beforehand, there was on the census a space for free number of Blacks and enslaved number of Blacks in America. But then after the Emancipation Proclamation, those records no longer exist. However, we do know that a lot of Southern slaveholders, or maybe not a lot, but Southern slaveholders would not tell their slaves immediately, or did not for years after that they were free. So that we can't even say if these numbers are statistically accurate. This also goes into hand to think about what are some motivations behind the census data. Some other considerations that came to my mind was that there was a deliberate attempt to limit the number of Black people and their impact by way of the 3/5 compromise, and considering a Black person 3/5 of a person for the state. There was also tax purposes that Southerners would not qualify or quantify all of their slaves for the financial aspect of being able to evade taxes. So all of these other considerations you have to think about when you see things, even as simple as the census data and how it was constructed. So here's a list of some considerations that you may have to think about in your study. It can be race, religion, income, legal status, that's immigration, undocumented, culture, ethnicity, occupation, neighborhood, complexion, and politics. And that's just to name a few. And also it can be said that culture can encompass all of these different assets. And some limitations that you may have. And I just wrote some based off of what I've experienced personally in my research and things that I've seen while in the field, is that there are certain stigmas. You might have limitations to transportation and how people know a city or how they can get around. You may have language barriers, legal status, being people of undocumented status might not even want to speak with you for fear of what you could do to their legal status, or the location of the study. This goes hand in hand with things like occupation. Are you asking people personal questions at their job or around their family at a place where they might not be prompted to give you the most honest answer? And so, yeah, there are other considerations and limitations here, but these are just some things to think about when doing research and having your foundations. So now let's get into the actual research. And by that, I'm talking about ethical data acquisition and analysis. So the questions that I want you to ask yourself here are, who are you gathering data from and with what methods? This can mean, is it a survey? Are you having people fill out a map? Are you having them take pictures or just explain something? And think about the different ways that might be best to serve a specific community when dealing with them. The next question is, what settings are you conducting research in and how may that affect the results? This was a limitation and consideration that was previously mentioned. If you're talking to someone at work and discussing something like their gender identity or their sexuality, are they going to give you their complete honest answer? Or is that the best place to conduct that study to get the answers that you want? Should there be compensation? And how might that affect the results? A lot of time you see researchers going into communities of vulnerable people and getting a lot of data and things and being able to get high prize and praise from these things, but not necessarily giving back to that community in any way and just using them as subjects. and which isn't a problem unless you're personally benefiting from the work as well, in which case there's no problem with making sure that the people that contribute to the work are also compensated. And lastly, are you speaking with people who may have firsthand and authentic insight into the topic? With Black communities, it is not uncommon for the maps and the literature and the data about Black people to not come from actual Black people. And that goes into historically, who are the people gathering the data, what access do you have to do that research and things of that nature. But you really want to consider if you are getting firsthand insight or are you an outsider? And one of the best ways to do that is to look into prior research. That's seeing what has been done already, what questions have not been asked yet, what questions have already been answered, and what perspectives have been considered. Once you look into these things and you start to understand what has already been done, it's easy to build conclusions and to see where to go next, rather than just returning the wheel and trying to disprove things that have already been stated, which can also be done because, as I said, a lot of the work already has bias within it. So these questions can even be used to review a prior project and see what they may have missed, which goes into intersectionality that we'll be talking about a little later and Clinton brought up. So I'm very happy about that. So here's an example just on research that I wanted to bring up where I felt like they looked into all the different aspects very well. And it was on from the US Census Bureau on mapping Black children, a map of student delinquency and expulsion. And so on the left, you see the percent of all students who receive one or more out of school suspensions by district. And then to the right, you see the percent of Black students who have received one or more out of school suspensions by district. Questions like, why don't Black kids do well in public school and things like that have been raised, but you have to actually look into data, into details, and ask questions that shift the onus from the Black children and really acknowledge why schools are not serving Black children in better ways. So when I say this, I'm saying there's a school to prison pipeline. And like when we talk about Black children and Black young male adults specifically, incarceration is something that is frequently brought up as a problem with the Black community, but we don't necessarily talk about the factors and the contributing actors that play into part to leading them there. And in a lot of cases, you can search and see that Black students are disproportionately being suspended, being expelled for things that their white or non-Black counterparts might just get a pat on the back for. We can even further look into this when we see students with disabilities. And I know the left map looks a lot more populated than the right, but it's to be considered that there is a lot of a few areas just with null or missing data, or that don't necessarily have a significant Black population to be considered in this data. So when you look at things like this, you see that there's an internal problem that's a lot bigger than just being Black boys. When it comes to there's students with disabilities, and as you go into the more internal intersectional problems, you come to more conclusions about what the real problems are. And this was an article that spoke very well about the data that I'm showing you. It was the schools to prison pipeline, Black kids get cops and white kids get docs. And it speaks very well to about how Black children are criminalized for being kids in a lot of different senses. And it aids to the school to prison pipeline in a very dangerous way for the Black community. And if we don't have people looking at these very intricate details, it allows for questions and for statements like Black kids don't do well in school to fly without really having any recourse. And so the last section that we're going to get into are the results, summarizing and explaining your findings. So I have 3 big tips. And number 1 is to separate your interpretations from your results. What that means is that a lot of times historically, there has been data that will say, for example, Black kids don't do well in school. and that is the result from the data that we just saw. If I go back to the data, this doesn't necessarily tell us that Black kids don't do well in school. That could be an interpretation of the data. However, it's not the result of the data that we had. So it's important to be able to tell your results from your interpretations. And would that be a good interpretation of the data? I don't believe so, because there has to be additive analysis and inquiries into why you're saying what you're saying. But this is just to start at separating your biases, your beliefs, and what's actually there, is understanding what specifically was the interpretation and what was the result. Next is that the results may be different than your expectations, and that is perfectly fine. Sometimes we come in with our biases and we're wrong, and that's how research works. So when you find those things, it's important not to try to prove your point, even if your data is not showing that. To the quote that we saw earlier, scientists have historically done research that benefits what they want to say and discredited research that went against it for the sake of being able to populate or to be able to popularize their point. But that's not good data or good analysis. So it's important to try to look at what you're viewing as statistically insignificant or things that don't matter to your project, and think about why you feel that way. And are you jeopardizing the validity of your project by not considering certain aspects? Which goes into the third part, which is drawing complete conclusions. And this is where we get into intersectionality, because it's very easy to talk about Black issues as Black issues, but most of the time they're not. Black issues usually have intersections of poverty or of wealth, of occupation, of race, religion. Blackness is a multifaceted race and identity. So it's important to draw complete conclusions and not just stop where you feel like you found the answer. Think a little further, think about the intersections, and think about other things that could contribute to your project just being a better, more analytical piece. So here are some articles that were looking at data about health specifically, but not necessarily attaching it to race specifically or calling for more data between races. Because what we can see in the first two on the left are about coronavirus specifically, and about how recently the past administration made calls to leave out racial data in terms of medical forms when it comes to the CDC. And a lot of institutions in terms of health did not agree with that decision because it left vulnerable communities a lot more vulnerable, simply by not accounting for the differences that they might be facing solely based on identity. On the right, there's a question of why do hundreds of US women die annually in childbirth, which is a problem that we know in the US is very expansive. However, for Black women in the community, this is a major problem and affects Black women at a rate much higher than most other women in America. When we begin to consider intersectionality, we begin to come up with more complete conclusions and plans of actions. So these are from the Center of American Progress, where they had a blueprint on eliminating racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality. So that's speaking specifically to why do women in the US die so much from childbirth. But we have to acknowledge that there are racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality. And when we begin to address that, we make more equitable solutions to help all Americans. And for the bottom one, it's the CDC, and they're talking about how health equity considerations, talking about health equity considerations and racial and ethnic minority groups, because they have put a major importance on understanding these differences and disparities to help America solve the problems more holistically. This is from the Learn Gallery, where, as I said, I work on the Learn GIS team. If you go to learn.arcgis.com, you can try some of these lessons out yourself. As you see on the right, we have a racial equity and social justice section where you can specifically look at issues around these topics. This is new, so we're adding issues to it. There's not too many now, but there will be in the future. And two that I just thought did well, if you guys wanted to try some, would be map breast cancer differences by ethnicity. Here are just some illustrations of what you do in the lesson. And it looks at racial disparities and mortality rates for breast cancer in America. And then one of our new lessons that just came out this month is examine racial inequities in unsolved murder cases. And so, yeah, you go through and you make these graphs and you make these maps, and you can analyze it for yourself and try to come up with some conclusions and think about what's there, what's not, who's being accounted for and who's not, and things like that are the type of attention to bias that we really need in order for the Black family to be mapped in an adequate and equitable way. Thank you. And happy Black History Month.
Thanks, Patricia. Let me switch screens for a second. You said a lot, and I was going to take notes to really focus our conversation and get back into everything. But if I can ask the other two panelists to join in the conversation real quick. You've all now met Patricia. I want you to also meet Kristen Washington. And Kristen is a doctoral student at the University of Maryland, College Park specifically. And Kristen, maybe before we jump into this conversation about overcoming bias, maybe you want to take a minute or so to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you for having me. As you shared, my name is Kristen Washington. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a doctoral student. I specifically think about the ways that Black digital geographies showcase the places, digital and material landscapes that we move across and how we come to them. And I was someone who used GIS software to build out my first research project, Dare to Remember, a digital memorial of Black Brooklyn. So I would love to speak about the bias and the silence that I encountered on that really intensive project, and some of the ways that I chose to kind of subvert that so I can tell a more comprehensive and expansive story of Black life in Brooklyn.
Great. Thanks for that introduction. Come back, Patricia. Again, really powerful work there, Patricia and Kristen. I'm looking forward to creating space and opportunity for us to showcase some of the work that you're developing. There's just so many things that I wanna talk about and touch on from your conversation, Patricia. Just so much. What would you say is like the biggest takeaway that people should have from what they just saw?
I would really say that we have to understand that implicit and explicit bias have been ingrained into our social, political, and economic structures, even in the ones that we think are the most neutral. And it's to no fault of our own, but as those that are engaging with and curating data, that it's important to constantly question the existing data and the motivations behind it, as well as continuing to understand our own bias so that we can minimize it in the works that we produce. So all of that is really just keep asking questions, because nothing is definite. As you said, history is made every day. And a lot of the history we understand is what someone told us, and we have the right to question it, and we should.
That's powerful. And before we go any further, I do want to address some elements of a question that Terry Wilson brought into focus. I'm not going to reread the whole thing, and Terry, towards the end, if you feel like you still have more to say on that particular topic, we can definitely address it in the Q&A and give you access to just add your voice to the conversation, which I think could be great. And there's this idea that I'm constantly pushing back against. Like folks will say, let's do a vulnerability index and let's put race in there as a vulnerability, but they're not saying let's put race in there because they're not saying, well, let's put white in there and all of the racial categories that we think of as related to white. That's not what they're saying. And the suggestion is that being black, to be focused on this event, but being Asian or Hispanic or being Latinx or being Croatian or being, a Native American, that is a vulnerability. And the thing that I push back on is that I'm not inherently born vulnerable. There's no physiological failing that is directly connected to my race. It is, if I am vulnerable to anything because I'm black, it's that I'm vulnerable to racism. And what Terry points out is that people are shifting to the terminology underserved, and I just want to like talk about that distinction, right? When you're doing analysis and you're thinking through the problem and you're thinking through the solutions, and you have a framing of vulnerability based on race, you're missing out potentially on the reality that that racism is the issue, and the way and in one way that racism reveals itself is in how it serves, how communities get served, or how individuals or families or communities get served. What do you all think about that?
I can speak to that. I think that, yeah, I have my own issues with the vulnerability index for that very reason, just because race isn't necessarily, well, isn't a vulnerability unless you're dealing with racist structures. For example, just saying like Black people in all Black spaces don't see Black as a vulnerability when it's all around them. But when you're Black in a majority white space, or a majority any other space, then your race might make you more vulnerable. So I do think that that language even, and that's something that I didn't put into my presentation, but the language that we use is very important and very deliberate. Even for the one drop rule slide, how there's all these different classifications of mulatto and musty and things as it goes down. The language that we use to identify people and that we use to identify problems is very important. And if we don't use the right words, we could minimize a problem or go to or not actually serve a community because we're not addressing what needs to be talked about. So being the vulnerability index, I think we could do better than that.
I like why I struggle with the vulnerability index, and even the idea, like the language being so important. And Kristen, I'm going to ask you to jump in a second, but it's all, to me, it's like you have to say vulnerable to what and from whom, right? So it's like in a predominantly white space, my blackness is not the vulnerability. It does though make people who have bias against Black people, whether they realize it or not, systems that are racist against Black people, it makes me vulnerable to that bias. It makes me vulnerable to that racism. And then when we know what the act is bias, the act is racism, from whom, right? So then we can really track back to the issue. But anytime we just leave it at race makes you vulnerable, then we just continue to leave the possibility for the perpetuation of the idea that race is the issue and not racism. Sorry, Kristen, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was just saying I absolutely agree with what you're saying and the need to expound on the terminology when it is used. I think about Toni Morrison's, a really famous Toni Morrison's quote from Beloved, where she says, definitions belong to the definers and not the defined. And that may be loosely paraphrased, but the idea is that a lot of these definitions that have been created are created to categorize us, created to subjugate us. And the idea here is, as people who have the resources to showcase Black life or to showcase the issues that we're dealing with and find solutions, we have a job to not only change the language, but also create new ones that will that will help us understand ourselves in the context of the words and the definitions that we would like to be associated with.
Absolutely. I want to take another question from the audience. And I think it's the same kind of question. Tim Main asks, are there any indices you've seen that you find do this well instead of vulnerability? And I'm gonna begin by saying that I think indices make sense when the indices are looking at community community assets. What do communities have access to? Community conditions. What's in a community that may be creating harm or lead to benefit outcomes, right? And then there's some assessment of where folks are in terms of outcomes. But I think those indices have to be topic and geography specific. If geography isn't a part of your index, then the reality that Patricia's experience in California is different from my experience in Philadelphia will be missed, right? So it's on some level, someone needs to make a decision around the geography, but also when you're trying to, what is the index about? Is it about improving health outcomes? Is it about improving education outcomes? Even the notion that racism, if we just focus on racism for this conversation, is the same, it's going to show up differently in different spaces around different topics, around different issues. So I think indices have to be developed around geographies, around community conditions, assets, and outcomes. Do you all have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it does have to be very specific. I have familiarity with mapping, and I came to geography specifically through my project, as I mentioned before, questioning like how hasn't Black, like a map of Black people over the course of the history of the United States why is it not readily available? And that led me to find out that these terms have been pushed upon us. A lot of what Patricia was saying earlier was like we haven't even had a static definition of who we are, ranging from like free persons or slave to mulatto and octoroon, you know? So I think there's a lot of ways that we can deal with what Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson calls pregnant pauses. And one of the ways that I dealt with it in my my research project, Dare to Remember, a digital memorial of Black Brooklyn, is thinking about the different levels of silence that enters into our facts. So I believe it's Miguel Rolfe Trujillo. He writes his book, Silencing the Past. And in that, we see that like fact retrieval, which for me was like a place where I can go to. The census is an important place to look and understand like where these terms are shifting, also where landscape is shifting, because Brooklyn was not always the same as we see it on, like, for example, a New York City subway map, right? So there are different contours of the map. So trying to figure out where are facts generated, how is it shown? And then where do we exist within this like broader global context as well? Because I think that also informs how our definitions have been created. So I'm gonna just mention one other thing, but thinking of like, for example, the Haitian Revolution and what that did for the definition of Black, and what does that mean for the definition of free, and how that that then changes how we understand ourselves, and how white folks, for example, or even other relative ethnic or racial terms, how they're related to how we identify ourselves. I feel like it requires a greater scope and understanding of shifting definitions.
Thanks for that. Unfortunately, we had way more content and way more conversation than we actually have time. I'm really sorry for that. We're going to try to continue this conversation online, whether it's on YouTube, where this conversation was live streamed, in our North Star Facebook page, or in a new LinkedIn group. Everyone who registered for the event will send you out links where we can continue this very much important and needed conversation. I just want to thank again Patricia Williams and Kristen Washington for joining us here today, and thanks to all of you in the audience, particularly those who followed us for the whole series. Thanks a lot, and we look forward to sharing more of this important content with you over the months to come.
Thank you all.
Thank you.